Sometimes the biggest lie in a courtroom isn't spoken, it's planted. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed across the silent courtroom, sealing a moment no one thought to question as Judge Alicia Carter stood still at the defendant's table, her wrists restrained, her expression unreadable under the cold fluorescent lights that hummed faintly above, and for a brief second, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, not because they believed she was guilty, but because everything about the scene felt too smooth, too rehearsed, like a script everyone had agreed to follow without ever reading it. The prosecutor's voice droned on with confidence, listing evidence that had already been accepted before it was ever challenged. A small bag recovered from her vehicle, substances identified, procedures followed, everything clean, everything precise. And yet Alicia didn't react, not when the evidence was displayed, not when whispers spread through the gallery, not even when a few quiet heads shook in disappointment, as if the story had already been decided for her. She simply stood there, shoulders squared, eyes steady, breathing slow, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. Across the room, Officer Daniel Brooks leaned back slightly, arms crossed, the faintest hint of satisfaction resting on his face, the kind that comes when a plan unfolds exactly the way it was supposed to. His uniform crisp, his badge catching the light just enough to remind everyone who held the authority in that moment. To him, this was routine. Another arrest, another case closed before it even began. He had done everything by the book, or at least that's what it looked like, because in a system built on paperwork and procedure, perception was everything, and perception was on his side. The judge presiding over the hearing adjusted his glasses, glancing down at the file as if the outcome had already been written somewhere between the lines, and maybe it had been, because no one asked how a federal judge ended up in this position, no? One questioned the timing, the location, the convenience of it all. The courtroom remained quiet, heavy with the weight of assumption, and still Alicia said nothing, not when the prosecutor paused for emphasis, not when the evidence bag was lifted slightly higher for the room to see, not even when the judge prepared to speak, because somewhere beneath the surface of that silence, something was shifting, something invisible, something patient, and if anyone had been paying close enough attention, they might have noticed the smallest detail, the way her eyes moved, not in panic, not in fear, but with a quiet certainty, as if she already knew how this would end, as if the story everyone believed they were watching had already begun to unravel hours before any of them walked into that room. And just as the judge opened his mouth to deliver the next words, the camera of truth, unseen but ever present, was already recording every second of a case that, in reality, had never existed at all. Truth does not rush, it waits. 6 hours earlier, the courthouse had not yet filled with whispers or judgment, and the morning air outside still carried a quiet stillness as people moved in and out of the federal building with routine confidence, unaware that something far more deliberate was unfolding just beyond their line of sight. Alicia Carter stepped out of her car in the lower parking level reserved for federal staff, her heels echoing softly against the concrete floor, each step measured, composed, the kind of presence that did not demand attention but commanded it anyway. She wore a navy suit tailored with precision, her posture upright, her gaze forward, and yet there was something else beneath that calm exterior, something observant, calculating, as if every detail around her was being quietly recorded and filed away. Across the lot, Officer Daniel Brooks leaned casually against his patrol vehicle, watching without appearing to watch, his eyes tracking movement with the ease of someone who had done this many times before. He had already chosen his moment long before she arrived, long before anyone would think to question it, because to him this was not personal, it was procedural, or at least that is how he justified it. A quick glance around, a subtle shift in position, and the space between them closed without urgency, without suspicion, just another officer moving through his jurisdiction, just another morning in a system that rarely stopped to ask why. Alicia reached her car door. Again, after retrieving a folder she had nearly forgotten, and for a fraction of a second, everything aligned, timing, distance, distraction, the kind of alignment that does not happen by accident but feels invisible when it does. Daniel moved with quiet precision, a gloved hand, a small sealed bag, a motion so controlled it barely registered as movement at all, and then it was done. No noise, no confrontation, Nothing that would draw attention. Just a silent addition to a story that had not yet been told. He stepped back, his expression unchanged, his posture relaxed, as if nothing had happened, because in his mind nothing had. Just another detail placed exactly where it needed to be, across the parking level. Alicia paused for a brief moment, not turning, not reacting, but something in her stillness shifted. Her eyes lowered slightly, not to the ground, but to the reflection in the polished surface of the car window, a reflection that told her more than anyone else in that building could have seen. And yet she said nothing. She did not confront. She did not question. She simply closed the car door and walked toward the elevator, her pace steady, her silence intact, because sometimes the most powerful response is not resistance but patience, the kind that allows a moment to unfold completely before it is understood. Behind her, Daniel watched her leave, a faint confidence settling in as he reached for his radio, already preparing the next step, already shaping the narrative that would soon feel undeniable to everyone except the one person who already knew the truth. Because what he believed was control was in reality something far more fragile, something already slipping beyond his grasp, without him realizing it. And as the elevator doors closed on Alicia Carter, carrying her upward toward the courtroom where her fate would soon be questioned, the real story had already begun, not with an accusation, not with evidence, but with a choice, his choice, the one that would echo far beyond that quiet parking garage and into a system that was about to turn in a way no one inside that building was prepared to see. A perfect lie does not begin with words, it begins with timing. By the time Alicia Carter stepped into the elevator, the courthouse above her had already begun to fill with the quiet rhythm of another ordinary day. Security lines moving steadily, lawyers adjusting their ties, clerks carrying stacks of files that looked identical to the ones before them. And yet nothing about this day was ordinary, even if no one could see it yet. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime, and for a brief moment she was alone, surrounded only by the faint hum of machinery and the reflection staring back at her in the polished steel walls. Her eyes did not waver, not from fear, not from confusion, but from certainty, as if she had already calculated every step that was about to unfold. Because while Daniel Brooks believed he had just created a case, Alicia understood something far more important. He had exposed one, the elevator, reached the main floor, and opened into a corridor lined with marble and quiet authority, the kind of place where voices lowered themselves without being told, where decisions carried weight long after they were spoken. Alicia moved through the hallway with the same calm presence, acknowledging no one, and yet noticed by many. A few heads turned, a few eyes lingered, not because they knew who she was, but because there was something about her composure that did not match the chaos that would soon follow. Across the building, Daniel was already in motion, his voice steady as he spoke into his radio, reporting what he would later call a routine discovery, his tone measured, professional, practiced, each word placed carefully to build a narrative that sounded complete before it could be questioned. Backup was requested, procedures were followed, and within minutes the framework of the accusation had taken shape, not through force, not through urgency, but through structure, the kind that made everything appear legitimate from the outside. In the security office, a bank of monitors displayed angles of the parking garage, hallways, entrances, exits, silent witnesses capturing everything without interpretation, and among those silent feeds was a detail so small it could be missed by anyone who was not looking for it. A reflection, a movement, a moment that did not align with the story being told. But no one had paused the footage yet. No one had rewound, because at this point there was no reason to. The system was already moving forward, and systems rarely stop themselves. Alicia entered courtroom 3B minutes later, taking her place without hesitation, setting her folder down with quiet precision, her expression unchanged as the room gradually filled, conversations low, chairs shifting, the soft shuffle of anticipation building before proceedings began. She did not look toward the doors. She did not search for confirmation, because she did not need it. She already knew Daniel would walk in, and when he did, his presence carried the subtle confidence of someone who believed he was about to prove something undeniable, his steps firm, his posture upright, every detail reinforcing the authority he thought he controlled. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, And in that fraction of time something passed between them. Not recognition, not fear, but a silent understanding that they were no longer standing in the same story, because while he believed he was leading the narrative, she had already seen its ending. The hearing began like any other, formal, procedural, predictable, but beneath that surface something was building, something patient, something precise, the kind of tension that does not announce itself until it is too late to stop it. And as Daniel prepared to present what he believed was evidence, the truth was not rushing to interrupt him, it was waiting, watching, allowing every step to be taken exactly as planned, because sometimes the strongest case is not the one you argue. It is the one you let unfold on its own, and somewhere within the courthouse walls, recorded in silence and preserved in time, the first cracks in his story were already beginning to form, unseen, unnoticed, but inevitable. Power does not reveal itself in noise, it reveals itself in silence. The courtroom settled into a stillness that felt almost rehearsed, the kind that comes when everyone believes they already understand what is about to happen. The judge adjusted his posture. The clerk prepared the documents, and Officer Daniel Brooks stepped forward with the quiet confidence of someone who believed the system was firmly behind him. His voice carried clearly as he described the discovery in precise detail. Each sentence structured, each word aligned with procedure, the location, the timing, the chain of custody, everything presented in a way that felt complete, unquestionable, as if the conclusion had been built into the explanation itself. And for most in the room, it worked. A few heads nodded subtly. A few eyes shifted toward Alicia Carter with quiet judgment, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be felt. But Alicia did not respond. She did not interrupt. She did not object. She simply stood there, her hands still, her breathing steady, her gaze fixed not on Daniel, not on the evidence, but somewhere deeper, as if she were listening to something beyond the surface of the moment. And that stillness began to do something unexpected. It created space, space where doubt could exist, space where the certainty Daniel projected no longer filled the entire room. He continued, outlining the sequence of events, how he had observed suspicious behavior, how he had followed protocol, how the evidence had been recovered exactly where it should not have been, and yet with each step, he described, something subtle shifted, not in his words, but in the way they landed, because certainty without resistance can sometimes sound too perfect, too controlled, like a story that has been polished rather than lived. Across the courtroom, a federal clerk glanced briefly toward the monitors mounted near the side wall, feeds from security cameras running silently in the background. No one paid them much attention. They were always there, always recording, rarely relevant, until they were. Daniel reached the final point of his statement and paused, just long enough to let it settle, just long enough for the room to accept it as truth. And then he looked toward the judge, expecting acknowledgement, expecting the next step to move forward exactly as planned. But before the judge could respond, something small happened, almost insignificant, a quiet whisper between two officials near the back of the room, a subtle shift in posture from a man who had been watching more carefully than most. And then the silence changed, not broken, but redirected. Attention moved, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to be felt. Alicia finally moved, not with urgency, not with defiance, but with intention. Her head turned slightly toward the side of the courtroom, her eyes resting briefly on the same monitors no one else had considered important. And for the first time since the proceedings began, there was a hint of something different in her expression, not emotion, not reaction, but recognition, as if the moment she had been waiting for had just quietly arrived. Daniel followed her gaze instinctively, his confidence still intact, still certain, because from his perspective there was nothing to see, nothing that could challenge what had already been presented. And yet he did not know what those cameras had captured. He did not know what small detail had been preserved in that silent footage. He did not know that the system he trusted to support his narrative had also recorded the one thing he could not control, time, and how it moves without bias, without assumption, capturing everything exactly as it happens, not as it is described. The judge hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, long enough for the shift to become real, long enough for the room to feel that something had changed, and in that pause, the balance of the moment began to tilt, not dramatically, not yet, but enough that what once felt certain now carried the weight of a question, and Alicia Carter, still calm, still composed, stood at the center of it, not as someone defending herself, but as someone who had allowed the truth to arrive on its own terms, because she understood something Daniel did not. The most powerful evidence is not the one you present. It is the one that reveals itself when no one thinks to look. The moment a lie meets evidence, it does not fight, it collapses. The courtroom did not erupt, it did not gasp, it did not react the way stories often pretend it should. Instead, the shift was quieter, more unsettling, like the slow realization that something everyone believed a second ago no longer held its shape. The judge leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowing not in suspicion but in focus, as a court officer approached from the side with a tablet in hand, whispering just enough for the judge to hear. And that was all it took. No announcement, no interruption, just a subtle redirection of attention that began to ripple outward. Daniel Brooks straightened, sensing the change but not yet understanding it, his posture firm, his confidence still anchored in the belief that procedure would carry him through, because procedure always had. He had followed the steps, he had documented the sequence, he had presented the evidence exactly as required. And yet something in the room no longer aligned with that certainty. The judge's gaze moved from Daniel to the side monitors, then back again, and for the first time there was hesitation, not doubt yet, but the presence of a question that had not existed before. Alicia Carter remained still, her composure unchanged, but there was a quiet awareness in her posture now, as if the moment she had anticipated was unfolding exactly on time. The tablet was placed on the bench, angled slightly, and the judge tapped the screen once, then again. The courtroom did not know what was being shown, not yet, but the effect was immediate. The judge's expression shifted, not dramatically, not emotionally, but with a clarity that replaced assumption with observation. Daniel noticed it, a small change, almost imperceptible, but enough to unsettle the rhythm he had built. His eyes flicked briefly toward the monitors, then back to the judge, waiting, expecting the next step, expecting validation, but instead there was silence, longer this time, heavier, the kind of silence that does not signal agreement, but reconsideration. Across the room a few heads turned, whispers did not start, they held back, as if the space itself was waiting for confirmation of what no one could yet see. The judge finally spoke, voice steady but slower than before, asking for the security footage from the lower parking level to be displayed, not as a request, but as a necessary step, and in that moment the structure Daniel had relied on began to shift beneath him. Because footage does not interpret, it does not align itself with narratives, it simply shows. The screen flickered to life, grainy at first, then stabilizing into the familiar angle of the parking level. Vehicles, concrete, movement captured without context. The room leaned into it without realizing. Drawn not by drama, but by the quiet authority of recorded time, Alicia's reflection appeared briefly in the frame. Walking toward her car, composed, unhurried, exactly as described. And for a second it seemed to support everything Daniel had said. But then the frame continued, and time did what it always does. It revealed what happens between moments. A figure entered the edge of the shot, partially obscured, moving with intention but not urgency. A motion so subtle it could have been overlooked if the video had stopped too soon. But it did not stop, it played, and in that continuation the detail became impossible to ignore. The approach, the brief contact with the vehicle, the precise movement of a hand that should not have been there, the timeline that did not match the report, Daniel's report. The room did not react loudly. It did not need to. The shift was internal, collective, the kind that moves through people without words. Daniel's breathing changed, just slightly, his posture tightening, his certainty no longer filling the space the way it had moments before, because what was on that screen was not an argument, it was not an accusation, it was simply a fact unfolding in real time, and facts do not ask for permission. The judge watched the footage again, slower this time, every second stretching just enough to make the truth undeniable, and when the screen finally went still, the silence that followed was no longer neutral, it was decisive. Alicia Carter had not moved, had not spoken, had not defended herself, because she had not needed to. The evidence had done what it always does when allowed to exist fully. It told the story exactly as it happened, And for Daniel Brooks, standing in the same uniform, in the same courtroom, with the same badge catching the same light, everything he believed he controlled had just been replaced by something far more powerful, something he could not rewrite, something he could not explain away, something that had been there all along, waiting to be seen. When truth finally speaks, it does not raise its voice, it rewrites the room. No one in the courtroom moved immediately after the footage ended, not because they were unsure of what they had seen, but because certainty had just shifted from one side of the room to the other without warning, the kind of shift that does not need explanation, only acknowledgement. The judge leaned back slightly, hands resting on the bench, eyes no longer scanning for confirmation but fixed with quiet clarity, as if the decision forming in his mind had already separated itself from everything that had been said before. Daniel Brooks stood where he was, but the space around him felt different now, not physically, but in the way attention settled, no longer supporting him, no longer aligning with the structure he had relied on. His shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly, his jaw set, not in defiance, but in the effort to maintain control over something that was no longer his to control. Across the room the prosecutor remained still, papers untouched, the narrative he had been prepared to defend now incomplete, because evidence does not argue. It replaces. Alicia Carter finally shifted her posture slightly, not stepping forward, not asserting dominance, but simply existing within the new reality that had formed, her presence unchanged, her silence still intact, but now understood differently, no longer passive, no longer uncertain, but deliberate, the kind of silence that allows everything else to reveal itself. The judge's voice broke through, calm, measured, but carrying a weight that had not been there before, asking Officer Brooks to clarify the timeline of events once more, not aggressively, not accusingly, but precisely, as if the answer itself was no longer the point, but the contrast between what was said and what had been seen. Daniel responded, his words controlled, repeating the sequence as he had documented it. But something had shifted in the delivery, a fraction slower, a fraction more careful, because now every word was being measured against something he could not adjust, something already fixed in time. The footage remained on the screen, paused at the exact moment where movement told a different story than the report, and that still frame held more weight than any statement in the room. The judge nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition, and then the question came. Simple, direct, unavoidable. Asking how Officer Brooks accounted for the presence captured on the footage before the reported discovery, a question that did not accuse but did not leave space to evade. And for the first time since he entered the courtroom, Daniel did not answer immediately, not because he did not understand the question, but because the structure he had built did not contain an answer that could exist alongside what was now visible to everyone. The silence that followed was different from the ones before, no longer neutral, no longer patient, but definitive, the kind that signals a boundary has been crossed and cannot be returned to. Across the gallery, a subtle shift moved through the observers, not whispers, not reactions, but the quiet recognition that the story they had assumed was unfolding had just been replaced by another, one that had been there all along. Alicia's eyes moved briefly toward Daniel, not with triumph, not with anger, but with something far more final, understanding, as if she had already seen this moment long before it arrived, because she had, not in detail, not in prediction, but in principle. She understood how truth behaves when it is allowed to exist without interruption. It does not rush. It does not demand attention. It waits until it can no longer be ignored. The judge turned slightly, conferring with the clerk, then back again, the next words delivered not with force, but with certainty, ordering a formal review of the evidence, an immediate suspension of the presented charges pending investigation, and a referral for internal and federal examination of the conduct involved. And just like that, without raised voices, without confrontation, the direction of the case changed completely. Daniel Brooks remained standing. But the position he held in that moment was no longer defined by authority. It was defined by exposure, not declared, not dramatized, but understood by everyone present, because the system he had trusted to protect his version of events had just done something else entirely. It had revealed them, and in that revelation, everything that once appeared controlled now stood exactly as it was, unfiltered, unprotected, and undeniable. Exposure does not happen in a moment. It unfolds in layers. The courtroom did not return to its previous rhythm after the judge's order, because something fundamental had already shifted, not just in the case, but in the perception of everyone present. What had once felt like a controlled process now carried an undercurrent of scrutiny, as if every detail, every word, every action was being re-examined in real time. Daniel Brooks remained where he stood, but the confidence that had once defined his posture no longer held the same weight. His shoulders still squared, his expression still composed. But beneath that surface there was a recalibration happening, subtle but undeniable, because authority without certainty begins to feel different. Across the room officials moved with quiet urgency, not chaotic, not dramatic, but deliberate, the kind of movement that signals something larger has been set into motion beyond the walls of the courtroom. Federal protocol had been triggered, not loudly, not publicly, but in a way that carried far greater consequence than any immediate reaction could have. Alicia Carter stepped back slightly from the table, her hands no longer restrained, her posture unchanged, but her position in the room transformed completely, no longer the subject of accusation, but the center of a process that had just shifted direction. And still she did not speak. She did not need to, because everything that needed to be said was already unfolding around her. A federal investigator entered quietly through the side door. Not announced, not introduced, but recognized by those who understood what his presence meant. His gaze moved briefly across the room, not lingering, not questioning, simply observing, as if confirming that the sequence of events had aligned with something already anticipated. Daniel noticed him, just for a second, and in that second something changed, not visibly, not enough for anyone to call out, but enough to be felt internally, because recognition does not require explanation, it only requires awareness. The investigator approached the bench, exchanged a few quiet words with the judge, and then stepped back, his role not to interrupt, but to ensure that what had begun would continue beyond this room. The judge nodded once more, the authority in that gesture no longer tied to the original case, but to the process now taking its place. An internal review was no longer just a possibility, it was an inevitability, and beyond that, something else had been set into motion, something Daniel had not accounted for when he believed this would be routine. Because routine does not trigger federal attention, routine does not bring observers into the room without announcement, routine does not shift the direction of a case before it even begins. Alicia's eyes moved briefly toward the investigator, not in acknowledgement, not in communication, but in quiet alignment, as if both understood the same reality without needing to confirm it. Because this had never been about a single moment, it had never been about a single accusation, it had been about something deeper, something that required time to reveal itself fully. Daniel adjusted his stance, his hands now resting at his sides instead of crossed, a small change, but one that reflected a larger shift. The certainty that once guided him now replaced by the need to respond to something he could not predict. The room itself seemed to hold a different kind of silence now, not waiting, not uncertain, but aware that what had started as a simple proceeding had transformed into something far more significant, something that extended beyond the immediate, something that would not end when the gavel fell. The judge's voice returned once more, outlining the next steps with clarity: an official suspension, a formal investigation, and the preservation of all evidence related to the incident, each word precise, each instruction final. And with that, the structure of the case was no longer in Daniel's hands. It had moved into a system designed not to protect narratives, but to examine them. And as that realization settled, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, the weight of what had been set in motion began to take shape, not just for the courtroom, not just for the case, but for the man who had believed he was in control of both. Because sometimes the moment you think you have defined the outcome is the exact moment the outcome begins to define you. Consequences do not arrive all at once. They build, piece by piece, until there is nowhere left to stand. The courtroom slowly emptied, not with noise or urgency, but with a quiet awareness that what had just occurred would not remain contained within those walls. Officials moved with purpose, documents were secured, digital records flagged, and every step followed a process that had now shifted far beyond a single case. Daniel Brooks walked out through the same doors he had entered with confidence. But the air outside felt different, heavier, as if the weight of the moment had followed him, his steps steady but no longer certain. Because certainty requires control, and control had just been taken from him without force, without confrontation, simply by the presence of something he could not alter. Across the courthouse, Alicia Carter remained behind for a moment longer, speaking quietly with the federal investigator who had entered earlier, their exchange brief, composed, and without visible emotion. Not because the situation lacked significance, but because everything that needed to be understood already was. The investigator handed her a folder, thin, unremarkable in appearance, but carrying a weight that extended far beyond its size. Alicia accepted it with a small nod, her expression unchanged, as if this moment was not a victory, not a conclusion, but simply the continuation of something that had been in motion long before this day. Outside the building, Daniel reached his patrol vehicle and paused, his hand resting briefly on the door handle, his reflection faintly visible in the glass, and for the first time he did not immediately move, not because he was unsure of what to do next, but because what came next was no longer defined by him. A call came through his radio, routine in tone, requesting his presence for a follow-up, but the wording was different, more formal, more precise, and that difference did not need to be explained for him to understand it. The system he had trusted to support his version of events was now asking questions it had never asked before, and those questions would not stop at the surface. They would continue, deeper, further, until every detail had been accounted for, every action reviewed, every moment measured against what had been recorded, not what had been reported. Inside the federal offices above the courtroom, screens displayed timelines, synchronized footage, logs of communication, all aligning into a sequence that told a story far more complete than any single report could contain. And within that sequence, patterns began to emerge, not just from this moment, but from others, smaller details that had once gone unnoticed now connected, forming a structure that extended beyond a single incident, the kind of structure that transforms a question into an investigation, and an investigation into something far more serious. Alicia stepped out of the building into the late afternoon light, the city moving around her as if nothing had changed, cars passing, people walking, conversations continuing, but she knew better. She understood that change does not always announce itself. Sometimes it happens quietly, beneath the surface, until one moment brings it into view. Her phone vibrated once in her hand. A single message, short, direct, confirming that the review had already expanded beyond the courthouse, that federal oversight had been activated, that what happened today was not isolated. And she did not respond. She did not need to, because the process no longer required her input. It had taken on a life of its own. Daniel finally opened the door to his vehicle and sat inside, the familiar space offering no comfort, no reassurance, just a reflection of what he now faced, not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. The questions, the reviews, the quiet examination of every step he had taken. And as the engine started and the radio continued its steady background noise, one thing became clear, not through words, not through orders, but through the undeniable shift that had already taken place. The case he thought he had created was no longer his. It never had been. It had always belonged to the truth, and now that truth was moving forward without him, steady, precise, and impossible to stop. In the end, justice does not shout, it stands. Weeks passed, but the silence that followed that day in the courtroom was not empty. It was active, deliberate, moving through offices, across departments, through layers of review that did not rush and did not overlook. Because once truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. Daniel Brooks no longer stood in uniform inside a courtroom, no longer carried the same presence through hallways where his authority once went unquestioned. Instead, he found himself on the other side of a process he had once controlled, a process that examined every report, every statement, every second of recorded time with a precision that left no space for interpretation, only alignment with what actually happened. The investigation expanded quietly but steadily, uncovering inconsistencies not just in that single moment, but in patterns that had existed beneath the surface, patterns that had once blended into routine but now stood out under scrutiny. And with each discovery, the structure of his actions became clearer, not exaggerated, not dramatized, simply revealed. Across the city, the case moved forward through federal channels, documentation filed, proceedings scheduled, decisions made not by assumption but by evidence that had already spoken for itself. And when the final outcome was delivered, it did not come as a shock, not to those who had followed the process, not to those who had seen how each piece had fallen into place. It came as the natural conclusion of a truth that had been allowed to fully exist. Daniel Brooks was held accountable within the full extent of the law, facing years that could not be negotiated away and financial consequences that reflected not just the act, but its impact. And there was no dramatic moment, no raised voices, no final confrontation, just the quiet execution of justice as it is meant to function, precise, impartial, and complete. Alicia Carter returned to her courtroom, not with celebration, not with acknowledgement, but with the same composed presence she had always carried, her role unchanged, her purpose uninterrupted. Because for her this had never been about personal vindication, it had been about something larger, something that extends beyond a single case or a single individual, the integrity of a system that must be able to correct itself when tested. And on that day, it had. The courtroom filled once again with the steady rhythm of proceedings, voices measured, decisions made, the gavel striking with the same sound it always had, but carrying a deeper weight for those who understood what had happened, because somewhere in that same building, in the same halls where assumptions once moved freely, there now existed a reminder, quiet but permanent, that truth does not depend on who holds the badge, it depends on what can be proven. And as Alicia Carter looked out across the room, her voice steady, her presence unwavering, the lesson remained, not spoken, not written, but understood by everyone who had witnessed it. He believed he was the one controlling justice, but in the end, justice was the one that defined him.